Today is February 2nd, 2024. Welcome to Native Calgarian. Oki Naganago Mekoche Chestakomaki or Dekot Nagotene Siku. My name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use she and they pronouns. I honor the Blackfoot as the elders and members have been so kind to me on my Red Road journey. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name in Blackfoot, and Leonard Kenny taught me how to pronounce my spirit name in Satu Dene. My humblest apologies to the Blackfoot and Dene elders and language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Great Bear Lake tribe in Treaty 11. My people wore rabbit skin, so it's been referred to as the land of the hare people. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene Nation is uninvited to this area of Kincho Tine Indahe in Satu Dene, meaning many big dog town, named after the Calgary Stampede. I was born in Calgary or in Blackfoot. Mokinstis is Michelle Elliott, an English name that's afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act and Post status card by the Canadian government says Yellowknives Dene. Through my father, I am a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution, while having a Canadian Indian Act and Post status card, which is a colonial construct by Canadian policies meant to divide Indigenous peoples' inherent rights. Indigenous Two-Spirit, or the Indigenous 2SLGBTQ plus community, and Indigenous women are at the bottom of the Canadian socioeconomic ladder because of colonial trauma, imposed poverty, racism, gendered violence, and land theft. According to the 2023 Quality of Life report from the Calgary Foundation, 31% of racialized Calgarians cannot find suitable employment. I am not a social worker, nor an elder, nor do I speak on behalf of all Indigenous. I just share my journey as I walk this world. As a trauma-informed Dene woman who's attempted to run and join harmful colonial parties, spent money to be at expensive conventions, left home to travel to those conventions just to vote on incomplete policies that still allow for incarceration, a denial of justice, a denial of health services, racism, colonial trauma, and genocide of Indigenous and Black peoples. I have work to continue, reports to advocate for, and attempt to work within these systems meant to harm me and my community. I think of all of this today, and I hope we honor the many Indigenous lives lost for this so-called country named Canada. And just off script, as always, thinking about Palestinians and that so-called country named Israel. So I hope you see your role in the importance of stopping harm, and as a citizen, see your role in reconciliation and as a treaty partner. Pride Month should never be 1 month. It's important to understand that the straight agenda and gendered violence was and is forced on these lands by Christian outsiders. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as an uninvited guest and acknowledging your role as a treaty partner in a so-called time of reconciliation. Can they be performative? Absolutely. It's important land acknowledgements have meaning. I encourage everyone to introduce themselves with an acknowledgement of who they are, their ancestors, stories of displacement, and how you perceive your role as a treaty partner, a citizen of Canada, a refugee, or other land displacement. So we as Indigenous people know how safe you are to be around. If you won't pronounce your local Indigenous nations' names, won't say your pronouns, won't say your story of origin, won't acknowledge stolen lands, imposed economic oppression, your role in reconciliation, I determine how safe you are to be around myself, my family, and my community. Understanding land acknowledgements and their importance is Indigenous 101 because it immediately addresses colonialism, oppression dynamics, broken treaties, and lies taught today in Canadian schools nationally. That's why settlers and those who call themselves Native Calgarians or whatever town you're from, you show me you have no Indigenous 101 understanding. Jesse Winte's book Unreconciled explains it perfectly, as do many Indigenous authored books. Land Back is a movement that could save the planet from climate change created by colonialism and capitalism, but it would be a part of a treaty partnership, meaningful reconciliation, honoring global initiatives like the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, and just be truthful. And we're not there yet as a country. That's for certain. So I'm speaking to you on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the imposed U.S.-Canadian border are the Blackfeet, and north of the border are the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani. These lands are Treaty 7 now, signed in 1877 with signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Goodstoney, Chiniki, Bearspaw Nations of the Stoney Nations, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina. I acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit, status and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with the government signing on your behalf. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. For those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments and questions. Also, giving a review helps whatever medium you're listening from. I have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe, or you can go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcast, pinned posts on social media, and if you just want to hire me to talk or whatever. So I wanted to talk about a few different topics today. Israelism. I wanted to tell you about this documentary. So Justice for Palestinians has a lot of activities that have been happening since, unfortunately, October 7th. They had stuff beforehand, but it was things like trying to get city council to not approve giving money to Israel for the funding of the new sea train, things like that. And it just, October 7th just seems to change everything. So at the start of this event that Justice for Palestinians, they just asked us, since October 7th, what has changed you? And man, it was really wonderful hearing that, because I know for me, this Christmas especially, I just absolutely couldn't celebrate Christmas this year. For folks who don't know, this Christmas was canceled in Bethlehem by Christians, and everybody was okay with it. And I couldn't wrap my head around it at all. Seeing the pictures, being a part of like Telegram and a few other social media apps that were showing soul crushing pictures of children. And I just can't justify this ridiculous religion that's been imposed on these lands, and especially this year. And so that was something that I thought about. I didn't say it at the time, but just seeing Christmas trees still in windows and such, it's just incredible to me, the Olympics that people had to do to justify celebrating Christmas this year. And so that, I thought it was a great question to open up and ask people, because I think a lot of, especially Canadians, Calgarians, Albertans, Canadians, it didn't bug them. October 7th didn't change them, because they have so much anti-Palestinian bias that they just didn't give a flying hoot about it. So I thought it was really important that they asked that question. The whole point of the entire documentary really is settler colonial denialism, and that's Canada in a nutshell, right? For folks who know. But for folks who don't know, obviously, I would imagine living in that fake world would be so fun. So anyway, I wanted to talk about what I've seen real quick in the hopes that you feel compelled to go and watch Israelism. There was another screening I see coming up here as well. So there's at Mount Royal University, a group of Palestinians that are going to do it again. So I do really hope that people make time to watch this. And my understanding is that they will host community events. So if you reach out to them, because you have a group of people that will want to watch this, like I would recommend, of the 700 nations in Canada, every single one of them should be screening this, so that people understand what's happening there. It opens up with an annual birthright event. So Israelis, so for folks who don't know this movie, it's like if you ever seen Jesus Camp, it's like that, only for Israel and Israelis. And I think it's really important for people to understand it, because just like Jesus camp totally erased the true history of North America and the genocide that was perpetuated on North American soil, this is the same thing. It just totally ignores that Palestinians exist and that there's genocide, and go from there. So anyway, annual birthright events are where Israelis have been brainwashed to believe they have a birthright to be in Palestine. So they will hundreds and hundreds of events for anyone who identifies as Jewish to go there, and it's paid for, no problem. I just can't even possibly imagine that. So anyway, throughout the entire movie, they show the difference between Palestinian life being like oppression, as opposed to the Israeli way of life of just, it's like Canada. It's like you see the reservations and how underfunded they are and how awful they are, the oppression that's there. Whereas Canadians get to live a life of, honey and milk and happiness and skipping. And it's just disgusting that people literally have created a new life on the bones of the Indigenous people. So I can't recommend it enough. They had this one mother who is also a teacher who will not separate Judaism from Israeli, so that they're the same to her, and that's what she teaches, and that's what all of these children are taught. So like this one particular person said that he's been to Israel over 100 times from the States. There's so many different angles I could say how gross that is, but like carbon footprint alone. Anyway, the American Jewish summer camps always encourage Zionism. So you go to a Jewish school that promotes Zionism, you go to a summer camp that promotes Zionism, and then at these camps, you actually dress up like Israeli soldiers. They wake them up in the middle of the night and simulate being in the military. And all the visits are like wearing uniforms and shooting guns for the first time. So they're really indoctrinating children to be violent against Palestinians. So they encourage people, of course, obviously, to join the Israeli army and to advocate for Israel. And they have all of these like Israeli education ways of thinking. So, and I just say that because here in Canada, we cannot get Indigenous education, Indigenous languages, and Canadians are not taught the history. So it's the same concept of like, oh, we're never taught this. So then, oh my God, I had no idea. Big, big baby cries, that kind of thing. Something I learned, I actually did not know this. So all of the college campuses have a Jewish place that Jewish kids can go to. So it's Hillel. So it's like Hill, E-L. And they have free meals. You meet other Jewish students, and it's all about Israeli advocacy. And Israel has an IDF members on campus at all times, which makes sense considering what we seen 2 weeks ago when former Israeli soldiers had on campus in North America released stink bombs to pro-Palestinians. One person I'm following on Twitter is absolutely having long-term health effects from this. And yet here we go. This is what it is. So I'm doing this live while on TikTok, and one of my commenters said that Canada needs to stop funding Israel. And I'm telling you, go see Israelism, one, and two, you need to understand that Canada is Israel as to Indigenous people as Israel is to Palestinians. So I wish there was an understanding that when people are proud Canadians and they wave their flag, it's like, I'm proud to be a racist. I'm proud that we kill Indigenous people. I'm proud we continue to steal their land. And I'm proud we never learn about it in education system. And I'm super proud to vote for a colonial democracy that is from Britain and not from here. So you have to understand that's what I see every time I see Canadians pretending to be proud and waving their flag, et cetera, et cetera. So, when we talk about defunding it as Canadians, like, you have to understand Canada is what Israel wants to be. Every single thing that you see is something that is modeled from Canada. So, and why doesn't Canada pay for the resources it takes from First Nations? It doesn't. And that, like, call to action, in the calls to action, there's a business call to action, and we have seen so many Canadian companies do that, and I'm saying that sarcastic. None do. They don't share their resources, and I would argue that 50% of any profit in Canada should be given to Indigenous people, because that's what the treaty said, is equality. And people are taking those resources. The very least they should be doing is sharing them. But that's not the way settler colonial capitalism is designed and set up, and we need to have a serious conversation as a country about that. So in school, they, of course, never discuss Palestinians and say it was empty lands, and that's just like in Canada. One of the critiques of the famous five painters was that they always showed these pictures of Canada with no Indigenous people on there, and that's the point. A lot of Canadians that I meet, they'll go, "Oh my God, I had no idea First Nations still existed. You're the first one I've ever met." This is the type of shit I hear. People call them microaggressions, but they're not. It's just racism. It's full point racism. And the things that they teach in their teachings is that, Arabs only know terrorism and they want to kill all Jews. But if you talk to Canadians, we are painted as savages and that we were always fighting with each other. So that's just war propaganda that Canadians are taught too. So that's why I wish there was a documentary of Israelism and Canadians to show that what they are trying to achieve in Israel, is exactly what they did do here in Canada, by not, revenue sharing, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, at the end of the day, they want everyone to join the Israeli army. And they talked about, once you become a soldier, that their entire goal is to let Palestinians know that Israelis are watching them, just to keep them on their toes. Like, that's the whole purpose of them wearing their soldiers and going, or uniforms, and going into their lands. And yeah, it was just gross, because I know exactly what that's like with the Mounties and the police here going in and doing that to us as Indigenous people all the time. It's disgusting. And doctors and nurses and teachers and social workers, I could go on. So Palestinians, they have to grow up and never being allowed to play on those streets because of the way these soldiers are, watching them, so-called keeping them on their toes. And they also know, as Palestinian parents, that their first experience with terror, with soldiers, will just be through terrorism. And honestly, that's exactly what it's like for Indigenous people in Canada dealing with authorities in general too, is because they are racist and they treat us so poorly that our children are, of course, afraid of the military and afraid of the police, because that is everything that they do to us. And Canadians and North Americans are just like, what do you mean? It's like, you just don't know. In the movie Israelism, they even talked about, playing cowboys and Indians. I'm literally talking to you from Blackfoot territory with a whole bunch of non-Indigenous politicians pretending to be cowboys every single stampede. That's my reality. In Israelism, they talked about, in the middle of the night, Israel soldiers will barge into the houses of Palestinians and just decide to use their house for occupation. And there's lots of moments of shame by former Israeli soldiers realizing, like, it was wrong. They were taught it was a matter of security, but they knew in retrospect that it was wrong. So I do hope that people watch that And I also hope that the RCMP that are policing the Wet'suwet'en today, I hope in retrospect, they end up feeling shame and realizing that what they were doing to them was wrong. But the great thing about racism, it actually stops people from feeling the shame that they probably should. The way the Israel Defense Forces treated Palestinian teens, it's the same way the RCMP treats the Indigenous teens that we see here. And I don't want to exclude municipalities, like my own teen daughter and her friends being pulled over by the Calgary police for absolutely no reason whatsoever, being told they have to show ID when, as you all know, most teens, one, don't have ID, and two, it's actually against their civil liberties to be forced to share them when they're not driving. So it's, it's just, that's, Israel's just doing what Canadians taught them, right? I also wanted to talk about the security of the settlements is the same way that Canadians talked about the original forts that were here in Canada. So a lot of our towns are still named after forts, and nobody in Canada thinks that's even slightly ironic. And they're like, what do you mean we're a settler state? But ironically, like, we have proud settler societies here, especially in southern Alberta. Here in Calgary, we have a proud settler society. We have lots of pioneer societies. So it's just so ironic to me that they just don't know the history at all here. I have less rights in Canada, just like Palestinians have less rights than the Jewish population in Palestine. I don't like to call it Israel because Israel's fake, just like Canada is fake. But most people don't get that yet. So, but the truth is, the Palestinians are a second-class citizen in Israel, and just like Indigenous people are second-class citizens here in Canada. And I thought it was important to say that. Zionists see Palestinians as jihadists, and they kick around Palestinians while handcuffed and blindfolded. But you know what? This is exactly what the RCMP do to us. Exactly. They call us savages. The RCMP out at Wet'suwet'en were just on the record calling Indigenous people orcs from Lord of the Rings, and just dehumanizing terms like that. And then kick us around while we're blindfolded, handcuffed. There's a video that just came out of Roy Cardinal getting, handcuffed by so many RCMP, even though he has jurisdiction to be where he is. But I just see police and Israeli soldiers as like bullies with guns, and it's really dehumanizing. They said this is what non-democracy systems look like, where Palestinians have no rights, and they finally just called it apartheid. And that is what we have in Canada. Again, South Africa, literally, who, by the way, we want to give a huge shout out for what they did at the International Courts of Justice. The original British that colonized South Africa, again, used Canada as a model. So I wish people really understood the gravity that, whereas South Africa was dismantled, it's not dismantled here. Excuse me. So, I did make some notes here, so I'm just trying to go through them. Back in the US, the campus students, so the story is kind of based on two Jewish folks. And when they get back here and they'd hear Palestinians talk about occupation, apartheid, settlements, they couldn't refute it, because despite all of the training that they had with all their education system, all their Jewish camps, they weren't taught these things. So that's what actually made them become Jewish Voices for Peace. And there is a whole movement of Jewish voices that know what is being done to Palestinians is absolutely wrong. And that's, again, why I recommend Israelism as a documentary for everyone to watch. The red roads on the maps are no-go places. So, and here in Canada, like, we just tell people not to go on reserve. Some of the Palestinians show how Israeli folks will ruin the water even after the water is fixed. And we see that here in Canada, where there's a concerted effort to try to fix the water, but then we still go and approve exploration projects that we already know are causing issues. So, for example, here in Alberta, we know that the tailings ponds of the bitumen are filled with carcinogens that is causing cancer downstream to the Dene, but everybody's okay with it, just like Chalk River and nuclear waste and many instances where they just continue to allow expansion of exploration that can purposely dirties the water here in Canada. So, and that's what they do in Israel. Racist bigots hate the Palestinians. Canadians are racist bigots that hate the Indigenous people here. So it's just a cycle that continues. So you fix the water just for it to get wrecked. You fix the water just for it to get wrecked. And I would argue businesses need to be doing more, but they're not, because they're the worst bigots there are, actually. So it was really an interesting moment when they were showing the Israeli army with their bulldozers going over the tents of the refugee camps of the Indigenous people, because that's exactly what they're doing here in Canada with dismantling all of the encampments that we have across this country, because we've been homeless and they don't care, So they spoke about Auschwitz being the start of where the intergenerational trauma source is. And of course, that we need to be doing the healing from that as well. And I would agree with that 100%. Most Canadians are completely unaware of what Indian residential schools really are. And there's a whole movement to discredit it, just like there's a whole movement to discredit what happened during the Holocaust deniers, right? So we have that happening here as well. And when the Jewish population, the Americans who go home and try to tell the truth about Palestine and Palestinians, they actually don't know how to talk about Palestinian oppression. And there's a lot of hurt and understanding within family and friends, and sometimes their relationships dissolve over that. Well, we see that here in Canada, where some Canadian allies try to go back home and tell them, look, this is what we've done to Indigenous people here and continue to do. And there are family members that will never talk to you again, and friends that you will end friendships over. And I am absolutely one of those people that lost a ton of friends from talking about these issues, and even family members, because there's not a real conversation about what is happening here. And so it's hard. I wish more Canadians felt that way, but I know they don't. So I wanted to talk about this concept they talked about in an Israelism called the self-hating Jew. And they basically say, oh, well, you just obviously hate yourself, and that's why you're advocating for Palestinians. And I find that really similar to what we have here in Canada for Canada Day, where people will be like, oh my God, well, if you're not a proud Canadian, you just must hate all Canadians. And it's like, no, I want the truth to come out, and Canadians don't want that truth to come out, just like those who are Israeli don't want the truth to come out about the oppression of Palestine in order to be Israeli. So just the similar circumstances was just really important, I think, to point out. The divide between Jewish folks is putting the human rights side at risk, and that is the truth. So when you have Trump in your corner, know that you're on the wrong side of history. Yeah, so we here in Canada, we have Pierre Poilievre, and he is an absolute pro-Israeli. I mean, most Canadian politicians are actually, at the end of the day, and that makes it really hard because it's settler colonialism here in Canada. So of course they're on the side of settler colonialism there, and that makes it really difficult to call out. But the actual rise of anti-Semitism is not being called out. And that is actually part of that conversation where, you know, if you hate Jewish people, if you hate, that's easy to say, anti-Semitism, but a lot of Palestinians are saying, well, they're the original Semites too. And a lot of Jewish folks who are for Palestine are saying that being pro-Zionist is actually its own form of anti-Semitism too. Whereas with the folks who are pro-Israel are just like, if you are not pro-Israel, then you're an anti-Semite. And that's causing a lot of friction within their own community. Just like in Canada, some settlers are wanting to talk about the truth in Canada, and some settlers are denial. So it's the similarities were fantastic. So anyway, I do recommend that you follow Simone Zimmerman. This was a really interesting story. There's a female and a male, and she's the female, but she was working on Bernie Sanders' campaign, and then to see her own people who are pro-Israeli turn on her and attack her, so that Bernie Sanders had to basically get her off the team because she would be too much of a liability in the world of pro-Israelism. So I found that really interesting because I know a lot of Indigenous women and girls will speak up against the horrible abuses that we have in our own communities, and then are marginalized and erased and not talked about because they had the audacity to speak up against oppression. And but at least a Jewish person is in a higher ranking than a Palestinian. And just like as in Canada, like a lot of Canadians will find themselves, if they talk about the rights of Indigenous people, they will find themselves being attacked by more non-Indigenous people. So yeah, the parallels were fantastic. I just wish there could have been somebody to talk about it as we go, but it is what it is. Hopefully people listen to this podcast and share that, and then watch the movie themselves and put together their own. Because if I could sit down and really analyze it, I'm sure I could put way more talking points together. And I just encourage everybody to watch Israelism. Another thing that happened last week that I was really shocked by was the conversation about the stupid Barbie movie. So Barbie, the movie, had a bunch of nominations, and a bunch of the white feminists got all upset in their panties in a tizzy because their main star and their main director weren't nominated for Academy Awards, whereas Ken was. And I was just like, oh my God, this is stupid. But then in my own social media, I seen so many Indigenous people being on the side of this. And I'm like, are you guys kidding me? So I did actually watch a movie, and there was a lowbrow smallpox joke made. I wasn't even going to give it attention until what happened last week. And then in the movie, they also had the Mountain of the Four Founding Fathers. Indigenous people have been trying to educate non-Indigenous for years that was a desecration of those mountains. I'm here in Blackfoot territory, that is in a different area, but here in Blackfoot territory and in the mountains is even more stony Nakota area. That's their traditional territory prior to the treaty and prior to colonialism. You know, everybody talks about how sacred those mountains are. Everyone, we call them grandfathers, and when we have sweats, we talk about them as grandfathers, always watching us because they've been around for millions of years, whereas we're here for a speck of time, like a dog is to us. That's what we are to the mountains. So anyway, desecrating them the way that they did in the States is something that we've always seen as anti-Indigenous. And yet settlers and colonizers are still like, what racism? What do you mean that was bad? And so to me, you know, I don't know how any Indigenous person would ever defend that stupid movie. It's just another white feminist movie about white feminism. So anyway, I actually did lose a couple of followers over it. I lost a friendship over it as well. And I obviously not too upset about that because it's a friendship that wasn't meant to be. Obviously, it's a sad reality to me that the amount of effort people were willing to put into defending white feminism Barbie than Indigenous people. And to me, I was like disgusted by it. Frankly, I'm still disgusted by it, actually. I just don't understand how, you know, folks can be so blind to talk about the bigger issues of smallpox not being a fucking joke and the desecration of our mountains was never okay. And then more so to the point that a lot of people would internalize the attack. And that is actually an example of internalized racism. So I actually shared Donna Bevins. If you listen to my podcast, I give this resource at the very end of every podcast about internalized racism and unpacking white supremacy within ourselves. And that's really what I came to the conclusion of, was that we still have a lot of work as Indigenous people to really unpack the white supremacy within us. And I mean, that's been my journey in my 40s because, I was born in a white supremacist world. I was raised by my white father, and I was, not taught my Indigenous culture on purpose. So, like, this is all unpacking and decolonizing that, right? So I highly recommend that people do that. I never thought this Barbie movie would be such a damn controversy, but here we were. But what was interesting, and I've already mentioned it on the podcast, was Lily Gladstone had gotten the nomination. And because she's part of the Blackfoot Confederacy, I think that every single person who lives on Blackfoot territory should be honoring that. That said, it came out a lot where they were saying she's the first ever. And I think this was a great conversation to have about terminology. And I seen a little bit of this in my comments on my TikTok, where people were kind of arguing over terminology of what to call people. And at the end of the day, like, she was the first Blackfoot person to be nominated for an Academy Award. Should have left it at that. But no, people misused terminology of Indigenous, Natives, North American, Native American, all these stupid terminologies that white people have imposed on us. So that was disappointing to kind of have to unpack a lot of that and be honest, and talk about some other actresses that had already gotten that nomination that identify as Latin, because they're Indigenous people too. So yeah, a lot of conversations. I think there was a Hawaiian as well who had been nominated at one point in time. So, it was interesting seeing the nuances of that conversation happen and not happen. And again, seeing a lot of settlers and colonizers put their opinion out there when it's unnecessary. And sadly, seeing so many Indigenous, not use proper terminology on all of that. So anyway, wild that we have to have these conversations, but we do because of the education system that is purposefully keeping people ignorant on Indigenous issues. So grateful to have this, but I also seen, of course, the white media totally missed the point on all of this as well. So just wanted to give a shout out to, I want to say her name is America Ferrari, and she was in the Barbie movie. And of course, she had an epic speech. I don't know who wrote it, but at the end of the day, like, she was being nominated, and that wasn't in the news at all. So it was wild to me, the dynamics of white supremacy and anti-Indigenous racism in social media as well as in mainstream media. And for those who are in Canada and have read the National Inquiry's calls to justice, there are actual guidelines for folks like me, for all people to be using in social media and such. Lots for Canadians that goes in one ear and out the other because they refuse to actually read and do the work of learning about these things. So, I just think it was important to address it here in this medium, in the hopes that people would kind of reevaluate what they're looking at, what they're sharing, and maybe put a little truth to it. And if you look through my TikToks and my social medias, I did try to address some of that with some of the tweets, crediting the people who had tweeted it in the hopes that we're not hurting anybody's feelings. So a big thing that's happening right now today that is just upsetting me. My premier is in the news, and she is in the news because the UCP is the party that she's with. So it would be like the equivalent to the Republicans if you're in the States. And they've been taken over by like an extreme right-wing group called Take Back Alberta. These are like the most ignorant people who don't believe in science, who have an agenda to own liberals and liberalism. And I should probably say neo-colonial liberalism. It's just so frustrating. So anyway, these Take Back Alberta folks wanted to basically attack trans people. And to me, this is a really simple thing. You attack the 2SLGBTQ community, you're a Nazi. It's simple, point blank, because that's what they did. So why people want to attack one of the most equity-seeking groups, I will never understand. But for them, equity-seeking is oppression, right? When you're on top and people want to have equal rights, ugh, gross, can't do that. So they're attacking our trans youth right now. They're saying no to puberty blockers. You are not allowed to have them anymore, which we know will absolutely result in suicide and suicide attempts. And the thing about puberty blockers is that they can help a child while they are making decisions. And this isn't something that's done easily. It's something that you have to do with psychologists and such. Like, it's not an easy thing to do. That said, so the premier also said, oh my God, we will so use child services in order to help these youth that need help. And I'm like, shut up, lady. Because especially here, we have a disproportionate amount of 2SLGBTQ plus that are homeless, because we literally live in a city, province, and country that just do not care about homeless people and at all. Like, and we're seeing that in, if you listen to my podcast, I talk about the frostbite, amputations, lack of mental health services, et cetera, et cetera. Like, that is the most empty threat ever. Something that's not being talked about because we don't allow Indigenous voices at the table for these conversations is that, one, it's an exclusion of our treaty rights. In treaty, we were supposed to have access to healthcare. This is absolutely taking that away. Two-Spirit were here first. And I tried to tell people that this Christian straight agenda was imposed on these lands, right? So this is an extension of it. So I get so freaking annoyed with the racist LGBTQ community that just magically forget that they're colonizers and that this system of oppression was imposed from their own people. So, and the other thing that makes me mad is that we have 231 calls to justice from a beautifully written report of the National Inquiry that talks completely about gendered violence, way better than the National Action Plan, which was haphazardly put together. And like, folks who are non-Indigenous in the LGBTQ community they won't read the National Inquiry. They don't see how this is part of the issue and solution. 231 solutions, but no, in one ear, not the other, because of anti-Indigenous bias and racism. That's just the way Canada is. So that just upsets me to absolutely no end. And I wanted to take it one step further and say, like, there's this new pretend Indian, and I can't remember her name, but it's something Fox, starts with an S. And it turns out this person was really problematic within the Two-Spirit community. And that's really upsetting, because it's hard enough to try to find safe spaces for Indigenous people. It's hard enough to find spaces that are safe for Indigenous Two-Spirit. Like, and then to find out we have this pretend Indian who is problematic within the community, hurting other two-spirit. I mean, I can't express the amount of violence that Indigenous people face by non-Indigenous on a regular basis. And we have so many elders who are already mean and not kind to our children. So I won't even let my daughter be around a lot of elders for that reason. And here we have another circle that wasn't safe, that created more harm than good. And I just get so angry that we let these people into our circles and then they cause all of this harm and havoc with absolutely no accountability. So just so many things. And then I went to go and voice all of this about the premier, about this fake Indian, and about two-spirit and harmful practices. And the stupid TikTok cut me off when I said white supremacy. So I left the video for my friends, people I follow back, so that they could see it, and then tried to do a second one. But I didn't touch on half the things I did in the very first one that got cut off. So for example, apparently this person was adopted in by a stepdad. And I thought, my mom, my stepmom is from Austria, and she raised me since I was like 6. So she was the person I was used to calling mom the most. And here I would never think to appropriate her culture and say I'm Austrian and then go around calling myself a term for Austrians for their 2SLGBTQ. I can't wrap my head around that level of appropriation to save my soul. Just can't do it. So, this is the type of thing I think about, and I'll never understand the level of racism of settler colonialism as I decolonize on all of this to think that it is acceptable as an adopted in white person to not only identify from that nation, but then to also identify as two-spirit and be harmful in these circles. The idea of pretendindianism in general is just, it drives me wild that somebody would want to feel oppression and systemic racism. But then again, they don't. I did growing up and throughout my entire life, but they've never had to experience that. So it's so frustrating to me that Canadians and Americans that are settlers come here and are like, I'm going to play Indian. But I will give a shout out to Making Treaty 7. So Michelle Thrush's last production was Indian and Cowboys, and it was so funny. She took, so for folks who don't know, Italians were dressed up as so-called natives for a lot of the first productions in media of Indigenous people. Part of the reason why I have this podcast is to try to dismantle some of those media misrepresentations. So anyway, they just played with it and had so much fun and had these like films in the background with Italian actors and then dubbed it with ridiculousness. So imagine like actual Indigenous people with Indigenous accents, like trying to pretend to be Italian with ridiculous lines. That it was so funny. I was laughing in stitches the entire time and so grateful I went to that. So then I didn't hear a lot of aunties laughing. It was mainly a non-Indigenous crowd. So it was just me laughing and my daughter every so often like, okay, calm down, mom. But I couldn't. It was too funny. So hats off to Making Treaty 7. They're one of the organizations I really have a lot of respect for, trying to bring Indigenous perspective into theater and arts here locally. And of course, we have the luxury of having this local celebrity of Michelle Thrush, who you will have seen in Prey as the mom. And yeah, she's been in lots of different movies and such, so I'd feel stupid trying to list them all, but just a really nice lady too. Anyway, I hope you know who Michelle Thrush is. Google her and watch shows and movies that she's been in, because she's just a great lady and does a lot for our local community here to try to help Indigenous youth. And we actually seen her. We were coming home from Meteor Shower, which was a Steve Martin production. We had gotten free tickets for it. So we went and seen that, and I bumped into Michelle Thrush, and she's like, "You got to come to my production on this." And I'm like, "Okay." But it was only like 4 nights or something. So, and I was so glad we did. And let me tell you, Michelle Thrush can sing. Because it was, there's this local celebrity here. His name is Chris Demeanor, and he's always a part of the Making Treaty 7 stuff too. So anyway, they're all singing and playing guitars and playing percussion, and yeah, Michelle Thrush really nailed a lot of the singing. I had no idea she was so musical, no idea. So just great time, really enjoyed those productions. And then I'll also give a shout out to there was a okay, I never say nice things about the CBE because they happily are proud to have John A. Macdonald High School and Diefenbaker Chiefs, and they don't understand systemic racism at all. They're just like, what? I have an Indian over here that said it was okay. So then they justified Diefenbaker Chiefs when we all know that if said Indian said, that's wrong, they'd probably get fired and nobody would have mentioned that, right? Anyway, that's a Reconciliation Action Group conversation. Bigger picture, there was one teacher that, for whatever reason, this one school my daughter is a part of is great. And this one teacher who is originally a music teacher was able to scrounge up 4 tickets to Indigidivas. So for folks who don't know what that is, there were 3 Indigenous singers that were singing with the Calgary Philharmonic Orchestra behind them, playing along with whatever it is that they had. So she got the youth 4 tickets. So my daughter went, my daughter's friend went, and she had 2 other friends that were supposed to go but canceled last minute. All natives understand this. So I found 2 other little native kids to go. So the 4 of them went, and the 2 natives that were last minute, they didn't enjoy it. So they went home at the intermission, and then the other 2 stayed, and they had a wonderful time. So shout out first and foremost to that music teacher at the CBE at Jack James High School that arranged that, because I know there was 2 Indigenous youth that loved it from start to finish, no question. I would have loved to have watched it, but I knew the 2 kids might have needed that ride, and they did. So it just worked out the way it was meant to work out. Really glad that they could be a part of that, though. So those were some interesting things that had happened. I want to get back to 2SLGBTQ issues in Calgary. For the folks who don't know who Pam Rocker is this amazing activist who is originally from Texas and really cares about 2SLGBTQ having positive representation within churches. Now, you all know I'm not a church person, but unfortunately, I am forced to be in churches a lot of the times for a lot of different reasons and around Indigenous people who are now Christians because of colonization. So, to me, it is important for this space of what we call gender affirming care in churches to be available. And then for folks who are really brainwashed by the churches to hate 2SLGBTQ, you can always refer back to her work and the work that she builds upon. So she has an organization called Affirming Connections. And what she does is she goes to churches and have churches understand and educate them on 2SLGBTQ issues, and then they become an affirming church. So Pi Day is coming up, and that's a big day for everybody because a lot of people think when you give people human rights that somehow you lose part of the pie, and that's not the case. So it's a fun way to play on it anyway. Pam Rocker came out just before Christmas, actually, and talked about this conversion therapist guy who's coming here and has been trying to encourage people to do activism, calling 311 and writing to certain venues, etc., for this to stop. And so I'm asking you to please follow Pam Rocker, please follow Affirming Connections, and please do the work that she is encouraging, or they are encouraging us all to do, because it's important that we bring this all to task. Recently, the 2SLGBTQ community had asked the TELUS Convention Center to not host Tucker Carlson. And regardless, they did, and he came, and our premier was a giddy schoolgirl who totally fangirled him and had them, and they spread a whole bunch of hate, and everybody was happily spreading hate together and smiled and took lots of pictures, and it was just a great hate fest. So the community, the 2SLGBTQ community, asked that the TELUS Convention Center lose this designation they had, and it's like a rainbow connector, and it's basically saying that this is a safe space for 2SLGBTQ. And because they hosted that event and didn't cancel the convent, they're clearly not 2SLGBTQ safe space. So they actually lost that designation. Thank God, thanks to the activism of our local 2SLGBTQ community. So that's why these calls to action are so important for people to follow and for people to do, so that way we can say, look, this place isn't gender affirming. This place isn't a place that's safe for 2SLGBTQ. And unfortunately, politically, here in Alberta, we're seeing that going further, to the point now we're going to see more suicides. So back to our premier, who doesn't care about homelessness, addiction, culturally appropriate services for folks with trauma, with folks with addiction. I do want to talk about the Stonewall Recovery Center. It is first of its kind in Canada, and it's a treatments facility for folks in recovery that identify as 2SLGBTQ. You can follow them on X, formerly Twitter, but it's fun to dead name Twitter because Elon Musk, he is transphobic, and he actually has a child that he continues to dead name. So for the record, I hope you all continue to use the word Twitter and never X, just to piss off Elon Musk. I do, and I enjoy doing it every single time. So anyway, you can follow them at Stonewall YYC on Instagram. They're at Stonewall Recovery, or you can go to their website, stonewallrecovery.ca, and they have a gala coming up, so you can give them some money to help actually have bricks and mortar one day and build this building so that they can do that work. And I can see that a few of us on my Twitter or on my TikTok live are enjoying some of my jokes, and thank God, because I make jokes and I don't know if people get them. Anyway, so a serious note though about that gala is that I have been collecting Two-Spirit names. I already have at least 12, and I talked to a family about that, and it was really positive. So I'm going to be recording that memorialization of their names, how we use it, and go from there. So that I'm going to talk to them. So here's the thing. I've been advocating in the 2SLGBT community since at least 2016, probably before that because of MMIW. And what I found in the MMIW circles is that there was transphobia and homophobia within those circles. So I had to do education there to start acknowledging the Two-Spirit, because that's gendered violence. And then when Black Lives Matter in Toronto stopped the parade, we formed Voices here in Calgary to talk about racism within the 2SLGBTQ community. So with that, I've been trying to educate the 2SLGBTQ community how missing and murdered Indigenous Two-Spirit are part of this conversation of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So that's why my acronym is always different than everybody else's, because I always add the 2S and I always add the T, because trans is so different when you're an Indigenous Two-Spirit. It's a whole conversation, that's for sure. So when I'm in that circle, I've been to their gala before. It's predominantly non-Indigenous 2SLGBTQ2+. I'll talk about the calls to justice, reconciliation in general, and in the hopes that motivates them to see the National Action Plan is a piece of crapola, and the National Inquiry for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit is the best model for us to be working in. It helps everybody. And those who are Black or people of color, like, there are answers of racism in those two, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, as well as the National Inquiry report, that would help all of Canada if we could get everybody behind it. So that's always my pitch when I'm given the mic to talk about these issues. And if you're listening and you have the opportunity to use that pitch, please go for it, go do it, use it, and know that it's the right thing to do, because we should be honoring our Two-Spirit. And if we only have 12 names so far, I know we're missing lots. And I'm asking you, if you know Two Spirit that need to be memorialized, please message me, tell me their names. And then I got to do a little bit of, checking them if they have living relatives, making sure it's okay with them before I go say it, that kind of thing. So I just really need your help with that if you want to memorialize our Two Spirit as we should. Whew. Wow. Okay. So if you are a settler and listening to all of this and you're like, oh my God, what can I do? You should be a part of a reconciliation committee by now. And if there isn't one, please go start one. Start doing the work that we need to do across this country. I have a book club. It is free to everybody. It's a Zoom link. So literally all you have to do is Zoom in. It's not, I don't know why people have it in their head that a book club means that you have to start in this date and you can never join a new book club. Like, that's bullshit. I join book clubs all the time for like one book and that's it. So anyway, if you literally want to learn about Indigenous people, please join my book club. If you don't have time because it's the second Monday of a month and you're like, oh, well, that's when I have student council meeting or whatever it is that you do, start your own book club. Do it. Just do it. Learn about these things. Read the National Inquiry. Like, it's 2 good volumes. And read the TRC. It's like volumes of books. So these are things all Canadians should be doing. I have a hard time talking to Canadians because they're so ignorant. It's like, I can't even talk to you. You have no idea what you're talking about. So anyway, because it's Black History Month, we are doing a book about defunding the police. And it's, I think these are important conversations we have to have. We're not funding mental health, homelessness, safe supply, recovery, but we are funding cops. And that they're causing trauma, which is leading to homelessness, addiction, et cetera, et cetera. It's a really bad cycle we're in. And it's really going to take Canadians waking up and speaking up in order for that to change. Anyway, I'm proud that this podcast has given solutions and cultural safety training, cultural first aid, and all of them to create a safer space for Indigenous, people of color, those with disabilities, and 2SLGBTQ to speak. According to the 2023 Quality of Life report from the Calgary Foundation, 88% of racialized Calgarians feel uncomfortable and out of place because of their religion, ethnicity, skin color, culture, language, accent, gender, or sexual orientation, which is up from 75% in 2022. So I would imagine this next year is going to say a lot more for all of the folks with, who care about Palestine, who care about Muslims. I know that's going to go up. And of course, there are a lot of folks that just think that they are so oppressed. Anyway, well, now we're going to have tons of trans people who literally are being oppressed by their own damn premier. Do want to give a quick shout out to Skipping Stone and Egal Foundation. They are going to take the government of Alberta to court over this. Thankfully, our federal government is speaking out. I'm a part of the federal Liberals, so obviously this matters to me at that level as well. I wish they'd do more, but I do what I can too. I also want to give a shout out to Mansour. I just thinking of you. I know what Israelis do to Palestinians that are in custody, and I'm seeing horrific pictures of what they've done to your children. And I am trying to support your mom as I can and support justice for Palestinians as I can. And I know that Taylor McNally is in jail right now, serving her sentence because she was stacked with all of these charges thanks to the Calgary police. And she's a single mom just trying to survive Calgary's racism. And that's, Calgarians are okay with it. They say awful things all the time, like, oh, she did this, she did that. And I just unfriended somebody else who blamed Brandy Morin for being charged by the Edmonton police for covering what the homeless encampments and what was happening in Edmonton. It is shocking to me how mean people can be about standing up for human rights and human dignity. Anyway, 84% of racialized Calgarians believe racism exists, and 66% of non-racialized Calgarians believe in racism. How those both aren't 100% is just like a slap in the face. I want to say thank you to Cheryl Ward, Chelsea Branch, and Alicia Fridkin of heretohelp.bc.ca. What is Indigenous cultural safety and why I should care about it? Their work and those cultural action tools are available for people to use. So please support Indigenous work like that as part of your reconciliation and settler understandings. I'm just lucky enough to highlight and repeat them here. Internalized racism and lateral violence is another form of violence Indigenous and equity-seeking groups experienced by the structure of oppression and racism imposed on these lands. Go to racialequitytools.org. There's tons of resource files. And Donna Bevins created What is Internalized Racism? If you have some money, give it to her. Skipping Stone, Egal, Stonewall, Stop the Stack YYC. I'm just going to keep listing all these places you can give money to. Do's and don'ts for bystander intervention by American Friends Service Committee. So if you go to afsc.org, they have a whole schwack of do's and don'ts for bystander intervention to help people when you see a Muslim person being yelled at on the C train, or you see an Indigenous person being misused, like, go and do something, people. Holy. I wish that anyone who follows me on my social medias would watch the anti-racism organizational lead for the city of Calgary give their committee a presentation on the journey of becoming an anti-racism leader. It's on YouTube. If you were to Google journey of becoming an anti-racism leader, I'm sure you would stumble upon it. And it's something you can watch while doing dishes. Again, Taylor McNally, Adora Nofour, our Calgary Black Lives Matter activists are being legally targeted. Please go to Stop the Stack. There's also gogetfunding.com, legal fund support link as well. I have been sharing these things. They're in my link tree. If you go to Stop the Stack, they have lots of information for you. If you don't know that Taylor McNally and Brandy Morin and Adora Nufor are being charged by police indiscriminately, and you don't know that means they're stacking the charges, Stop the Stack YYC has that information so that you can understand the gravity of that. Please educate yourself, because BIPOC people are being targeted because of your ignorance. Indigenous people have been speaking about our issues, sharing our traumas in reports, commissions, and public hearings, just so it can be regularly disregarded. No more. Honor our words, honor the treaties, listen to politicians and their policies and platforms. If they don't recognize equity-seeking groups in their budgets with Gender Equity Plus, if they are cutting violence prevention programs, Indigenous education, mental health services, uterus health choices, gay straight alliances, puberty blockers, lack of human rights for migrants, immigrants, folks with disabilities, know that your vote for that party directly negatively impacts equity-seeking people. Demand that they implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, the recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the multiple reports about child welfare reform and violence prevention programs, and now the 231 calls to justice from the National Inquiry. Provincially, Kenny created the 113 Pathways to Justice. The Premier's Council has done pretty much no work on that. Municipally, we have the White Goose Flying Report. For folks who follow me on social media, you'll have noticed that the Calgary Economic Development put out a whole report on just Indigenous economy. It's, as far as we know, it's one of the first of its kind. So hats off to the city of Calgary for that. Well, I guess it wasn't the city of Calgary. It was more the Calgary Economic Development Group, which is a form of, so anyway. Denying all these reports is a form of abuse called gaslighting. And I'm hearing the 2SLGBTQ community basically call out the Alberta government for gaslighting them. And I know people are experiencing extreme racism in all of these institutions with multiple reports that say the same thing. I will say this too. Another thing that pisses me off, that you're not hearing in mainstream media as a talking point is that QT BIPOC are going to be like this whole new policy is going to be weaponized against them by racist teachers. Not all teachers are racist, but the institution is inherently racist. There's no mechanism to take out that racism, and a lot of teachers thrive in that racism and are unknowingly racist. So just know those phone calls to parents and social workers, it's just going to be a new form of oppression for QT BIPOC. Way to go. Way to go. Demand change from politicians, platforms. They don't understand colonialism, racism, privilege, sexism. They have zero business running. Should be understood by all parties, local politicians, community organizations, sports clubs. Holy, those flames. I didn't even talk about the sexual assault thing from the juniors. I mean, I don't even like it, but whatever, here we are. Google articles on how non-Indigenous Canadians can become allies. Stephanie Harp and I did an emergency podcast over a year ago trying to talk to people about the issues of homelessness and people missing. So she encouraged me to really start sharing aboriginalalert.ca. So if you follow me on social media, you'll have noticed I have been. You can also download Missing Children's Society of Canada. Apparently, she's working with them to have them more Indigenous friendly. I was asking people for over a year to check out womenshomelessness.ca for the statement to demand urgent action to protect the lives of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people experiencing homelessness. But I know that went in one ear and out the other because none of you told me you did write your municipalities on that. Anyway, last podcast, we had our good friend come and talk about what it's like as a harm reduction advocate, to talk about life in the city of Calgary when it comes to the drug poisoning issue that we're having. We have amazing stats that are out there right now that you can see we are not thriving. I'm asking you, if you use substances, please don't use alone. If you are using alone, you can make an action plan. You can use the National Overdose Response Service at 888-688-NORS. There's also apps, the Brave and Doors and Lifeguard apps that you can use to help create a safety plan if you are using substances. I just want to give a little shout out to my pharmacist for trying to be supportive of me getting Narcan and giving them out as I do. I wish all non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people would do that and help our homeless population. Anyway, if you're experiencing emotional distress after anything I talked about today and need to talk, you can call the First Nation and Inuit Hope for Wellness helpline at 855-242-3310. It is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you go to their website, hopeforwellness.ca, they have a little text box there as well. If more related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, you can call 844-413-6649. It is a national toll-free 24/7 crisis call line. You can also go to 60 Scoop Indigenous Society of Alberta, ssisa.ca, the Indian Residential School Survivor and Family Hotline, 866-925-4419. The Native Youth Crisis Hotline is 877-209-1266. For non-Indigenous, there's usually a distress center line in your area, functioning 211, or you can call the new national 988 number. You can also call 833-456-4566 or text 45645. You can go to crisisservicescanada.ca for more of those crisis supports if that's what you need. Kids Help Phone in Canada, 1-800-668-6868. The following are 2SLGBTQ crisis supports. I want to give a shout out to the Trevor Project for helping our youth, 866-844-7386. You can go to lifevoice.ca for more crisis supports, and for the trans Lifeline in Canada, you can call 877-330-6366. Violence is my everyday reality. Every Indigenous generation has faced it. This is self-care, how I take my power back, how we have Indigenous media representation instead of non-Indigenous speaking for us. That's why I started the podcast, to speak freely without interruption, tone police, leadership shaming, gaslighting questions, as many people don't want to hear Indigenous opinions, but sure want to tell their uneducated point of view. And they know nothing about us, colonialism, constant surveillance of our people, our protests, our vigils, and our rights. I and many others share info on microaggressions daily, so it's just unacceptable to say them anymore. Learn about being trauma informed. Folks like me are dealing with internalized racism and gatekeeping, and folks that survive off the status quo, people who are so in their trauma, they stop people from doing their work and deplete personal resources. Internal and external racism is an everyday reality for me, other marginalized groups, and I just want to say thank you to my ancestors. Thank you to my granny, my mom, of what strength looks like through your example. I want to thank my dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt, my stepmom for showing me what a proud culture is through her Austrian family and roots. Feel pretty funny after talking about how I would never appropriate her culture. Anyway, it's through her. I'm a second generation Calgarian. And to my husband, Darcy, I want to say thank you for being my husband, my childhood friend, the father of our child, my support down this journey of the red road. You have witnessed decades of racism and sexism. And to our child, we are blessed to learn from you daily. We are honored you chose us. You give me daily accountability to be a better and stronger person. I just hope my daughter and my family will be proud in the future of us discussing these present day issues in a way that they can understand. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. For those who cannot afford to give, just love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or questions. And I also have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe. Go to nativecalgarian.com if you want me to come speak to you or just listen to my latest podcasts. And I want to end by giving side eye to those Calgary rabbits. You're lucky I'm not Tradish. And my beautiful cousin would respond, are you being my dish? Thank you, folks, for listening.